the Speaker, I can tell you that both initiatives will deliver more than what that last government attempted to when, for instance, they put out a $1 billion infrastructure scheme.
Tēnā koutou, I'm Selwyn Manning, and welcome to this latest episode of A View from Afar. And today, political scientist Paul Buchanan and I will examine the implications of the Russia-Ukrainian conflict and how it impacts on regional security architecture. And in particular, we will assess Finland and Sweden's move to become NATO members and whether Turkey will prevail in preventing this from occurring and what those reasons are. Also this week, Russia's Vladimir Putin hosted the leaders of Russia's equivalent to NATO, and that is a smaller group of Stan states in Russia and Belarus, and it's referred to as the CSTO. So Paul is going to go into that, and we'll discuss what that meeting means. So what that CSTO stands for is the Collective Security Treaty Organization, and it includes Armenia, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Russia, and Tajikistan. So hopefully I've got my pronunciations acceptable there. But Belarus's authoritarian leader, Aleksandr Lukashenko, he really was the only leader that publicly spoke at the CSTO meeting. Putting Putin aside, that persuasively spoke about Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, Paul and I will analyse the CTO meeting, as I mentioned, and we're going to discuss its relevancy, particularly from a security and geopolitical perspective, and what implications all of this has on the East Asia region. But before we do, just remember that if you are joining us live via the social media platforms, do feel free to comment and make questions if you so wish to, as we can view those and we may include those in the program. So with that proviso done, let's cross to Paul, who is waiting online to deep dive into these issues. Good afternoon, Paul.
Tēnā koutou, Selwyn. How are you doing?
Yeah, very good. Ka pai, thank you, Paul. Now, broadly speaking, what are the implications of the Russia-Ukraine conflict on this wider regional security architecture, and also how it is affected, if you like, by Finland and Sweden's intentions to join NATO? So, Paul, that's quite a broad base, but I just wanted you to unpick that and put some perspective and structure to it, if you like.
Yeah, talk about
pass the
whole load.
Yeah, the whole load.
All right. Well, I'll even add some more baggage to it by way of introduction. Their military spending over the last decade has increased dramatically. Some estimates are 20 to 30% over the decade, and it accelerated after the 2014 invasion of Crimea and annexation of the Donbass regions.
So what are you talking about? What country are you saying? Russia in this case?
I'm talking about global military spending.
Okay.
It's just to frame what we're about to talk about. So we already have had a buildup of military spending, which is translated into weapons and whatnot. And the regions that have seen the most of it have been the Middle East, Central Asia, and East and Southeast Asia. Latin America hasn't seen a lot. Australia has increased dramatically, but otherwise, Oceania hasn't seen a lot. Even Europe's spending, that was one of Trump's gripes, was that spending had not increased. Well, the Russian invasion of Ukraine has changed the security landscape for the foreseeable future. And that's where all this spending now has a focus. See, the spending before was a hedge against future wars. Well, those wars have now arrived. And, even places like Malaysia are spending a lot. They're thinking about the Chinese. But the point was, now it's focused attention on the fact that bigger powers can bully their way in to neighbors and whatnot. And the response has to begin at home. You have to be able to make it costly to the invader, because no one else is going to be able to reply in real time. The buildup in the Ukraine has been over 8 weeks. Now the Ukrainians are mounting counteroffensives, but in that first week or so, it was basically up to them. So that's the broader backdrop. Now, we got to think about both the near and the far regional security implications. So let me just start with the obvious. The accession of Finland and Sweden into NATO is compelling proof that Putin's gambit has backfired spectacularly. He was opposed to Ukraine's admission into NATO. He has always done that Russian geopolitical argument that they don't want NATO on their borders. And in response to the invasion, he gets two long term neutrals to join this adversarial collective security alliance. And obviously, the Swedes and the Finns, for their various reasons, see a real threat in Russia. I mean, that's what's remarkable is the Finns, they know the Russians. So I'm not entirely surprised. The Swedes, it's rather dramatic because both the Swedish, the incumbent governing party, but also the opposition parties agreed to join NATO or try to apply for NATO.
Because they were softer on this at the beginning, weren't they, the Swedes? I mean, they were holding back, if you like. Not necessarily ruling it out, but they were just holding back, letting Finland take the lead on it.
Exactly. So something has changed their minds. I would imagine that some very serious intelligence sharing between NATO members and the Finns and the Swedes has occurred that have alarmed the Swedes in particular, into the point that they have changed this historical stance. I mean, it's really quite dramatic. The Russians have been able to accomplish what the West has not been able to do with regards to Swedish neutrality. And again, the Finns, they know the Russians, so I wasn't entirely surprised. Now, I know you'll anticipate this, and if you want to add into it, please go ahead and do. The fly in the ointment is that the Turks have objected to the admission of both Finland and Sweden. The reasons they're giving, which are pretty specious, are that there are Kurdish terrorists being granted refugee status in Sweden and Finland.
And now the West is soft on the Kurd effort, isn't
it? The PKK, they view the PKK as a terrorist organization. The PKK, like many political movements, has a political wing and a military wing. At that point, one man's terrorist is another man's liberator. The point here, though, is that this is specious because there are Kurds, PKK Kurds, all over Europe, Germany in particular. There are PKK Kurds in the United States. So, and the Turks have said very little about that. Now, admittedly, these two countries are applying for admission, so you can leverage that. But what's really going on is not about the Kurds. That's just a convenient, excuse to use. The real game is two-layered. It's a two-tiered game. What the Turks are stalling about is not the Kurds, but the fact that the U.S. has postponed a F-16 sale to the Turks after canceling an F-35 sale. Congress simply objected to putting out the latest multi-role fighter to the Kurds.
Why do you think Congress did that? What was their purpose in that?
I think there's a lot of distrust of Erdogan's regime in the United States, and it crosses the aisle. I mean, here's the thing. There are Republicans who like Erdogan because he's another one of those strongmen. But the majority don't trust him for a number of reasons. I hate to say it, but it could be because he's Islamicizing secular Turkey. And let's just say some people don't take kindly to that in the U.S. Congress. He's playing footsie with the Russians. See, he's trying to straddle the fence between Russia and then his NATO partners. A lot of people don't like that. But to be honest with you, I mean, Turkey has traditionally received top line, top shelf military equipment from NATO partners. And this cancellation was an insult to Erdogan, basically. The U.S. came back and offered F-16s. I think it's the E version, so it's a pretty modern version. Congress has stalled that. They're delaying the vote. So what I believe is happening. Oh, and then there's the U.S. objections to the B-300 anti-aircraft missile defense system, which is built by the Russians. And rather than buy an American anti-aircraft battery system, Turkey went with the Russian version. My understanding is the Russian version is demonstrably better at tracking and killing aircraft. Again, Congress did not like that because there was a sale in the works. So I think what he's doing is he's playing a little bit of tit for tat with the U.S. This is all about the U.S. And he's using as a cover the issue of PKK members seeking refuge in Finland and Sweden. I don't think it's going to block the deal. It may delay it until he's able to extract the concessions from the United States that he wants, but he'll get them. He'll
Yeah,
certainly get them.
he made it very clear overnight New Zealand time, didn't he? Immediately, a number of hours ago, that these were the grievances, that he was seeking concessions. He laid down pretty much, as you've said there, and it. I think from what we're saying coming out of NATO, they're referring it to not destroying the ambitions of Sweden and Finland coming in, but it's halting by way of negotiation. So, it was working around that. So it sounds like that both sides are, Turkey's wanting something from it, as you've detailed, and the United States, now the focus goes on it to see how it responds, if it meets those calls of Turkey. And one would imagine, if you stood back from this, Paul, is there a positive gain for the United States and NATO to have Finland and Sweden in? I mean, I'm taking note that last week you in particular were talking about how strong militarily the Finns are and what their contribution to NATO is considerable. So is this an area where Turkey is playing solid, clever politics to get what it wants?
Yes, it is. In short, yes, it absolutely is. Demonstrably, bringing Finland and Sweden into NATO will strengthen it immeasurably. I mean, this is a big deal in terms of what the Russians are now confronted with. And again, that's why this gambit by Putin has backfired spectacularly. And so Turkey's playing, the game, playing hardball. And as I say, it'll delay it. Even a delay is worrisome for NATO. If the Russians start making serious gains, then they could actually control half of Ukrainian territory, and so they want to get this sealed and delivered to use as leverage on the Russians to say, look, stop your advances. We're going ahead with the submission process, but we will do nothing more than that at this point. So I think it's resolvable. Whether it's resolvable within a month or whether it's resolvable, through the end of the Northern Hemisphere summer. You'd have to be in the room with the negotiators to know that, but it's doable. Now, let's just, as an aside, because oftentimes you and I are accused of being very anti-Russian and whatnot, and I can't say that I would disagree with that when they've invaded a neighbor. I'm not big on bullies. But let's think of it. And
I'll just point in my point of view of this. If you're looking at the priorities of what you support, I think human rights is the primary concern from my point of view, and you address the geopolitics secondly from that. And I'm surprised by a few people that have rejuxtapositioned that priority. But there you go.
Yeah, and you're a much nicer man than me. I'm thinking, he's human rights first. I'm thinking, it's just a bad idea to allow bigger states to invade smaller states. And I include the United States. We've been through this. We've been through this many times. Now, let's think about the Russian response, right? Because we're talking about the implications of this conflict on future regional security architecture. The Russians are going to want, in the first instance, they're going to want to reinforce their enclaves in Kaliningrad Oblast, which is on the Baltic Sea. It's a little Russian enclave. They're even threatening to put nuclear weapons in there. I don't really see any advantage to that because intermediate range nuclear missiles can be fired from Russia to all of Europe, the totality of Europe. So moving them forward would be a symbolic gesture at best and make, obviously, the enclave a target. What is it? Transnistria. I never get that word.
Transnistria.
Exactly. Transnistria, and pardon me for mangling that, they're going to want to reinforce their control of that part of Moldova. And that can be something that may even occur on the negotiating table
Yeah,
if
because
any.
they
Go
need
ahead.
Odessa. If they were building a land bridge across there, and their ambitions seem to indicate that some weeks ago, although I'll just put a question mark around it now, but they'd need a land bridge that goes right across Odessa, and Odessa's a very difficult achievement for the Russians to be able to achieve that. Yeah. So, if people look at the map, they look at the Black Sea, you look at where Moldova is positioned on the eastern side of Moldova, bordering onto Ukraine. There's that Russian enclave there. It is basically well, the Russians claim it as a state that's autonomous, it's not recognised, yeah? So that's where they're thinking of what Paul's talking about there. But since we spoke last week, Paul, there has been an achievement by the Russians of building a land bridge from Crimea, Mariupol, exactly up, and it's fighting to try and hold those eastern what it claims is Russian-speaking natural land areas on the east of Ukraine. And that seems to be where a lot of the battle is going on. But back to the strategy and the bigger picture. Sorry, I just wanted to tie that in so some of the audience was up to play with what it's shaped in the last week.
Yeah, and what's interesting is, I mean, if they can reinforce their positions, to the west of Crimea, then what you'll have is effectively some degree of control over that part of the Black Sea shoreline. And Odessa, of course, is in the middle of that, but you'd be blocking. It'd be easier to facilitate blockades of Odessa and that part. The major strategic gain that the Russians have made is not in the east. It's the fact that now they've secured that land bridge from Mariupol to the Crimean Peninsula. They basically control the shoreline. And that's important. I find it surprising that the Ukrainians are concentrating their counteroffensives on the east. There's something in the Ukrainian strategic logic that to them means the east is more important than the southern shoreline. I'm not sure what that is, to be honest with you. I would have thought that they would have fought in the first instance very hard to prevent the Russians from securing that land bridge. They haven't. They actually retreated rather than fight in the weeks before Mariupol eventually fell. And we'll see. Maybe there's a counteroffensive coming down the road. But the Ukrainians have decided to fight in the east rather than the south. I think that's a strategic gain on a part of Russia. Now, whether they capitalize is another thing. But it gets to the bigger picture. The Russians are going to come out of this war very damaged. I mean, we talked about this last week. Russian apologists notwithstanding, the hard fact is they're going to be politically or diplomatically isolated. They're going to be economically, if not crippled, seriously weakened by this, and they're going to be militarily degraded. So the first order of business, either under Putin or whoever succeeds him, is going to be rebuild Russians' military capacity, but also whatever diplomatic and economic ties it can muster. And this is where the CSTO comes in.
Yeah, I was just going to say that this is looking at what comes next. If Russia consolidates and holds what it's got in the south and parts of the east, and then its ambitions to actually overtake Ukraine, it's exhausted by that particular purpose. So it goes back to its original holding of those areas in the south. So what is next? Do we see implementation towards some sort of truce by degrees, and then the impacts on the broader thing? So if we're talking on this, that's basically tying into the CSTO meeting that was held this week, and what to make of their posturing, meaning mainly Lukashenko, the president of Belarus, and Putin in this regard. The others seem to me, you may correct me on this, but they seem to be there in person but non-participants in really many other respects.
Yeah, and I guess, let's keep this in mind. The future Russian moves and the moves of others vis-a-vis the Russians is contingent about whether they win or lose. If they win, they have some leverage over future interlocutors if they lose, they have very little leverage. And remember, the Russian military-industrial base is very weak. I mean, again, if you think that Russia has the GDP of Texas, and then you think that its military-industrial base is just a small component of that, they don't have the sustainability of the combined efforts of the West, in terms of their military logistical capabilities. So, win or lose, the Russians are coming out of this in a worse state than when they went in. Now, they may get some territorial concessions from the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians clearly feel that they have the upper hand, and they're clearly willing to protract this war as a bloodletting exercise on the Russians, because now we're seeing the first hints of dissent in Russia, even showing up on Russian-controlled television.
Yeah, can you
Where,
speak to that point a little bit? Because
yeah,
this is interesting turns.
Yeah, and again, you and I mean, we're not prophets, but we've sort of foreseen, the sort of information war, the open intelligence war, all those things, and they're all coming to fruition. And one of the ways it's come to fruition is that even with all the censorship going on in Russia, you cannot block everybody all of the time. People are curious. The Russians are, they're being told one thing, that things are going well, and yet they're now starting to hear about, lots of dead soldiers being brought home, that sort of thing. So they're going to encrypted apps to get their news. I mean, the Russians have as much trouble trying to shut down Telegram and all these, these sort of what in the West are right-wing social media platforms, but for them are just trouble. And they can't stop it. I mean, it's slowly but surely. And so what happens? They have military talking heads, retired military people, just like in the U.S. and elsewhere. And over the weekend, in one of the most watched Russian TV shows on state media, a retired colonel comes out and says things aren't going well. He says the world hates us because we did this. And it's hard for them to attack him. I looked into his background. He's a very distinguished military figure. Okay. So calling him a traitor and whatnot, that's, think of any, revered general in any country whose credentials are impeccable in defense of the motherland, and think how well that's going to go to start saying that the guy is traitorous because he's happened to offer some sharp criticism of this venture. So that pops up on state media. Well, that doesn't happen by chance. This isn't like this guy just freelanced. No, someone facilitated this. Someone inside the Russian government decided that a little voice of dissent in official channels might be advisable if this thing continues the way it is, which is not, again, good for Russia. So I think that undermines the Russians even further. And I sure hope nothing happens to him if the hardliners within Putin's entourage decide, well, whether he's distinguished or not, he's got to go. We won't brook anything. But that still doesn't stop the social media messaging, the larger, sort of information landscape that is slowly leaking into the Russian public and telling them that, contrary to what the state is telling them, things in the Ukraine are not going well. So what do you do on an official level other than try to censor? Well, that's where the CSTO comes in. Or excuse me, Collective Treaty Security Organization. Yeah. I would think that the Russians now, they need all the friends they can get. And remembering that I had talked about the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Far East as being the places where military budgets have expanded a lot, what he's trying to do with this meeting was two things. The first was a show of support for Russia and its invasion of Ukraine. And as you pointed out, other than Lukashenko, everybody was there in spirit only. I mean, it reminds me of that Robert Palmer song, "The Lights Are On, but No One's Home." They were sitting around there like stunned mullets. They had to be there. Okay, this was Don Corleone saying, Here's an offer you can't refuse. Come to the Kremlin and sit around for a photo op. Belarus has tied itself into this venture, so Lukashenko is going to swim or sink along with Putin, and he needs to start looking over his shoulder as well if this thing doesn't go well. But it makes perfect sense for the Kremlin to try to shore up their ties along their south central front. Makes perfect sense to me. He's probably asked them to increase their defense budgets, their spending on Russian equipment. He's going to try to boost his industrial capacity above and beyond what is needed to resupply the Ukrainian venture. But it makes perfect sense.
With all of this, what kind of threat or counterbalance does the CSTO actually offer when you look at NATO, in particular how expanded NATO is compared to 1993, even around there where advances were first starting to take shape?
Well, they could make trouble. I mean, I was thinking, okay, there's no real threat to the CSTO from NATO or from the West at all, to be honest with you. No one has a vested interest in going in and picking a fight with them, even over their fossil fuel riches. I mean, all these countries are rich because of fossil fuel extraction, which is controlled by the Russians in any event. What they could do is make trouble in places like Afghanistan. They can make trouble because they have borders with Afghanistan. So they could foment and facilitate the passage of irregular forces, Daesh and those type, in a way that the West would certainly be alarmed about. It's a double-edged sword, though. If you're facilitating and giving refuge to Daesh guerrillas to go into Afghanistan and fight with the Taliban, irony of ironies, now the Taliban are fighting Daesh for control of Afghanistan.
So the CSTO also, it has a similar tripwire to what NATO does, isn't it? That if any one of those states is attacked by an opposing force, therefore the whole collective responds. And so from that collective mind, is Putin basically in Belarus, maybe more so Belarus, kind of saying, look, if we get caught in the crossfires here and people come onto our territory, and remember Lukashenko was actually forcing the line that, in his view, the West's guns were focused and threatening on his borders. Mm-hmm. So do you think that kind of manoeuvrings is a significant threat to NATO as in general, and so therefore needed to be taken seriously, or is it the contrary?
Yeah, I don't think that. I think you're absolutely right. Okay, so the collective in this agreement is just like NATO's. Okay, they have their version of Article 5, but the key thing is they have to be attacked on their own territory, and NATO has been very careful about separating the defense of the Ukraine from attacks on Russia or Belarus. So Lukashenko, of course, is crying wolf because he's trying to draw that in. The thing is, each of these republics are sovereign nations, and although they're allied with Russia, they have their own interests to pursue. So they probably can see this as an invitation only if the West oversteps their bounds, at least in the minds of the Russians, and attacks Russia itself or attacks Belarus. I don't think that the West is going to do that. Again, the Ukrainians are doing a decent job of making the cost of this war exorbitant for Russia, and Belarus is quietly backed off. They facilitated the invasion from the north. Most of the invaders from the north have retreated back into Belarus and have gone east. And you don't see the Belarusians rushing to resupply them. So, it's a good move from Putin's point of view to show this solidarity and remind everybody that there is a collective security agreement that invokes the collective defense should any of these countries be attacked. But it's a bit of a hollow threat because no one's going to attack even Russia. over this unless they start, invading other countries using nukes. I mean, the scenarios are preposterous. Now, let me just say this. I had mentioned earlier, it depends on whether they win or lose. But what I was really thinking about when I said that was the Far East. And here's an interesting thing. I was actually involved in a discussion about Japan and China and Russia. And think of it this way: if Russia acquits itself fairly well somehow in this war, then it remains as a peer equal in the eyes of the People's Republic of China. It did what it did. It cost a lot, but they gained some territory. They were able to, retreat by saving face. That means that China will treat them pretty much the same as they did before the war. They'll respect their land borders. Remember, they have a huge land border in common. They will respect their maritime borders. The status quo will remain. However, if the Russians lose appreciably, even though China has supported them in this fight, then things change because, again, the Russians are going to be damaged on several levels. What can the PRC offer them but leveraging that offer is diplomatic cover, economic, support, I mean, literally rebuilding support, and military support.
And there's a few, just before you analyse those, there's a few contextual issues that we need to probably underscore there, that it seems an agreement amongst those that watch various things that the Russian Federation was in its descendancy before it invaded and attacked Ukraine. So what we have seen since the 24th of February is a degradation of its abilities to present as a great power around the globe. Yeah? It is obviously a significant power, but when you compare it to the People's Republic of China, Russia is no longer its equal. I think that would be fair to state categorically. The other thing is with respect to China, China has been diplomatically easy on Russia with its invasions of Ukraine, but it hasn't supported it in the multilateral bodies. It has abstained. So it's not saying we're against it, but it's abstaining. So the signals are quite a delicate diplomatic effort. The West, particularly led by the United States, has obviously criticised China in this. This is the context and the backdrop to all of this that you're talking about. And it raises, and I'll just bring up on screen, and it raises this man on screen here, who was obviously significant on the world stage going back many decades. And this is, for those that are listening and not viewing, Henry Kissinger. And the Financial Times, a little over a number of days ago, interviewed Henry Kissinger on his view here. And I'll just see if we can bring up this part of the clip where he speaks about the dangers of joining. If you're in the West and the United States position, he's raising concerns where you rope China or the People's Republic of China in with Russia on this and do not differentiate between the two. And he talks about how they went about it all those decades ago. It's only a couple of minutes, this part of the clip, and I'll just let it run here, Paul.
All foreseeable problems. I don't think we can generate possible disagreements, but I think circumstances, after the Ukraine war, Russia will have to reassess its relationship to Europe at a minimum, and its general attitude towards NATO, and so will America, and especially Europe, have to do when the lessons of this period sink in. And so I think it is unwise to take an adversarial position to two adversaries in a way that drives them together. And once we take aboard this principle in our relationships with Europe and in our internal discussions, I think history will provide opportunities in which we can apply the differential approach. That doesn't mean that either of them will become intimate friends of the West. It only means that on specific issues, as they arise, we leave open the option that a different approach, we are prepared to explore differences in approach in terms of our own relationship without discussing in the abstract what their relationship with each other would be.
So that was Henry Kissinger, and he's talking there as he went on to explain the dynamics between the People's Republic of China and the Russian Federation going forward, and whatever eventuates from here, and how the West, led by the United States in such efforts, engages in particular with China. And it was just an interesting take there, Paul, and I just wanted to bring that into the discussions as we explored it and analysed it.
Yeah, I mean, there's nothing to really disagree there. I mean, it would be folly to drive them into each other's arms by treating them as if they were one and the same. They are two nuclear-equipped adversaries of the West, to be sure. But divide and conquer is always better than forced marriages of convenience. What I think Kissinger did, though, he was talking mostly about the West, is he was denying the PRC and Russia some level of agency. At the end, he talked about their relationships vis-a-vis each other. And I think, because he's talking about how the West should approach these two authoritarian states, I think we have to realize that the Chinese, they're sitting there. And again, if Russia comes out of this with some measurable gains and what have you, I don't think the Chinese are going to necessarily increase cooperation with Russia unless there's some advantage to them. And the advantage to them would be mostly economic, because they're giving them some degree of political cover. They would be able to help the Russians rebuild their industrial capacity in the wake of this. That to me seems to be something they could do. If they lose, though, that is, the Russians lose, not in that they're thrown out of the Ukraine, but they eventually have to go home and they didn't gain anything appreciable, then I think the PRC has certain advantages, because they can go, and what was triggering my thought about this was a discussion about Japanese security in the wake of the Russo-Ukrainian conflict. And at first glance, you'd say, well, it has nothing to do with Russia and what have you. And many people in this symposium that I was watching said that as much. But on the other hand, if the PRC comes to Russia and says, look, you guys are a little broken right now, and we would like to have maritime rights, forward basing rights in Vladivostok. We would like to be able to cross through your territorial waters into the Bering Sea and the Chinthaka, I think it is, peninsula, which you have to remember, the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait is incredibly narrow. You can see Alaska from the Russian side and vice versa. The Aleutian Islands, which are Alaskan, are within sight of the Russian mainland. That's how far out they extend. So it's natural that the Chinese would want to be able to begin, as part of their power expansion into the greater Pacific, to push northwards as well as southwards, which we are preoccupied with. We've talked about this endlessly. Well, the south isn't the only place to go. And if the Chinese pattern of behavior is similar in the north, they will be seeking resources in far off places, like the way they are seeking resources in Antarctica. Well, under the Arctic, increasingly diminishing Arctic ice shelf, there's a lot of resources. And there's also open international waters, increasingly open, that they may have an interest in. So they may be able to leverage their relationship with the Russians as an increasingly, how could I put it, rather than an ally or a friend, a patron of the Russians in their time of rebuilding, and be able to secure certain naval rights in the far North Pacific that right now they do not have. The Russians are very jealous about guarding their territorial seas and keeping the Chinese out. See, the levels of trust between the Chinese and the Russians are not the same levels of trust that, let's say, the United States has with the UK or even Germany. Okay, that NATO over the years has built a lot of trust. Chinese and Russians are nowhere close to that. Remember that they have a long history of feuding over their land border. And so it would take a lot for the Russians to allow access to their territorial waters by the Chinese, but a defeat in the Ukrainian venture might be that precipitating event. And they get a lot out of it. If the Chinese are able to increase patrols when the Russians cannot while they're trying to rebuild. I mean, I know their Navy has not been involved in this war in a large measure, but they're going to be diverting assets into rebuilding their land army. Remember, they're already using, land army components from the Far East in Ukraine. So they've already started to run out of Western-based units. I think to myself, the Chinese may strike a hard deal with them and say, we have an interest. We're a great power. We can help you out. And let's sign something that's very friendly. You keep your sovereignty over these places, but you give us, again, forward basing rights, right of passage, that sort of thing, as part of the agreement. I could see that happening. Now, that will generate.
Yep. Sorry. Yep.
I'm just going to say that will generate not just a reaction, but a response from the likes of the Japanese, from the likes of the South Koreans. And that's the regional architectural changes that we're seeing. We're going to see an increasingly hardening of military positions amongst pro-Western countries in East and Southeast Asia, because to them, Kissinger may think that you've got to separate these two authoritarian states when dealing with them. But if you're Malaysia, if you're Thailand, if you're the Philippines, and you've been watching Chinese behavior very close up and personal for the last decade, and you realize that they're going to try to take advantage of the relative Russian weakness to secure an expanded zone of power projection, then I doubt your response is going to be very favorable. And that explains a lot of this militarization that I've talked about at the beginning, because I think what we'll see is a collective response, a collective securities response that, among other things, will see the revitalization in a military sense of organizations that are now very toothless, like the Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, CSTO for short. That's a talk fest. That Seattle is, basically, again, toothless wonder when it comes to military affairs. They're slowly but surely, in light of these events, becoming acutely aware of the vulnerability of small states when a great power decides to bully them. And so I think that we will see, how could I put it, an increasing hardening of the division between the PRC and both its hard and soft power influence in Asia and Southeast Asia, East Asia and Southeast Asia, and the hard power response of Western-linked countries in that region. So these will be big shifts. Now, the question remains, if you think about that swathe of countries, will India change its strategic posture in the wake of this war? Again, I think whether the Russians win or lose, but not significantly, I don't believe, because they want to straddle the fence. And so as a result, right now, they're buying Russian oil because it's heavily discounted. and India's got its own problems. So they're just taking advantage. The Middle East has been interesting as they've been sitting on the sideline, basically watching this, to include Israel. Interestingly, a lot of the oligarchs that have fled Western sanctions have fled to Israel. So I don't think that the security architecture of the Middle East is going to change dramatically as a result of this war. But further to their east, into Central Asia and then the Far East, I think we're going to see significant changes as a result of this, particularly if the Russians lose.
I'll just inject one little bit into that, there has been talk in previous years that a natural inclusion into the CSTO was Iran. Now, should that happen, should that security organisation come under stresses, that would pose obviously a significant readjustment of threat assessment in the Middle East. And from Iran's point of view too, that should it do so, it knows that it would have an impact, but what would move it onto considering such a move is another entire episode should we wish to do so. But just picking up on a couple of the comments came in, I just brought up on screen for those that are listening from Sam, who's made the comment, the West has many apprentices. I guess what we saw from the CSTO is there were a number of apprentices that were participating by way of silence in that meeting as well. I'll just bring up a couple of questions, a statement and a question that's coming in now. Kemp Sanders, he's made the comment here that, this is earlier on in the episode, he made this comment. CIA director at Georgia Tech 1 month ago, and he quotes here, direct quote, and I haven't checked this quote, but this is what Kemp Sanders has put here. The US government has taken unprecedented steps to declassify intelligence and use it publicly to preempt the false narratives, in brackets there, used by Putin in the past. He follows up with a question here. What has changed in the calculus in terms of risk of intelligence disclosure? Over to you, Paul.
In short, the risk of exposure. By that, what I mean is open intelligence sourcing. And again, Selwyn does versions of this. I mean, Selwyn's part of his business is built on open intelligence gathering and analysis. Is so good now that if you're lying, if you're withholding classified information that runs contrary to what is already out in the open, let's say a very good organization that uses open sources, Bellingcat. Now imagine if the CIA is telling you some silly narrative about, the champion Ukrainians overrunning Russian units and pushing them back into Russia. And then Bellingcat or other organizations whip out satellite photos that show that, no, that's not happening. That at best it's a standstill. You come across as fools and you increase the distrust of the public in your intelligence agencies. So I think it's an admission that open source intelligence not only is here to stay, but in many cases it's very good. In many cases it surpasses the secret stuff, in part because unfortunately many intelligence agencies succumb to tunnel vision or succumb to groupthink about what threats are and are not. Just think of the fact that right-wing extremism rose up in the West in front of everybody and no one was looking at it. It was right in their faces. They were
the other way. They were looking at what the intended targets were, the victims.
Right. They were well said. They were looking at the targets as if they were perpetrators and didn't realize, no, the perpetrators are sitting amongst us and we're just looking the wrong way. Well, that's just one example. And so I think that there's an admission on the part, not so much of authoritarian states, their intelligence agencies, because they still want to please the boss, but in democratic controlled intelligence communities, although there's the urge to keep everything secret and be, the keeper of the secrets, I think there is amongst the more reasonable folk just an acceptance, an admission and acceptance that open source intelligence again, is here to stay and very good. And there's no point in trying to contradict it or compete with it. Embrace it and become more transparent yourself. In fact, if you can see that Bellingcat has a scoop about Russian troop movements in some area of the Ukraine, then declassify the things you know about those movements and add to the public body of knowledge, because in the propaganda war, that's going to be very influential.
Yeah.
So I think it's a good question. And I'll just end with this. The irony, we talked a bit about, nuclear strategy and MAD versus flexible response a while back. Well, there still seems to be this impression in the public that, human intelligence gathering in particular is all cloak and dagger and, all sorts of, what is it you say here in New Zealand? Secret squirrel stuff. I never understood that, but it's a Kiwi thing.
Yeah.
Fear of squirrels. But no, I'd say 80% of even human intelligence gathering is going through open source material, open source sources. And so we're now at the age with social media, with commercial technologies like the satellite photographs, all done by private enterprise and what have you, that there's no point in trying to play as if the secret squirrel society is still running the show. The fact is open source intelligence is now the lead when it comes to uncovering, certainly, not just technical stuff like large troop movements, but the motivations of leaderships. Think of what human intelligence people do. They don't do the satellite stuff. They do some analysis, but they're trying to figure out, what Putin's inner circle are thinking. And you can be assured they're putting a lot of time into that. And they're doing a bit what we do here, that they're looking at future scenarios and saying, if this happens, then that will happen, so on and so forth. So
the future scenarios
CIA
is
into the 21st century.
Yeah, and also it seems like to me, point it out if I'm wrong, but it does seem to me that one of the questions that's leading the disclosure of what would have in the past been classified information and held tightly, but is what is the advantage? What is the advantage of putting this out there? What are the risks of putting it out there, and the balance between the two? There's obviously strong advantages for all those reasons that you've alluded to there, Paul, and underlined there, Paul. With respect to just...
No, I was just going to say, but remember, the thing you don't want to disclose are sources and methods, right? And in the older days, those were very secretive. Okay, you simply, let's say you've got, just broadly alluding to my past, you have an asset who's a government official in country A, and he's on your payroll. If you're, let's say, the CIA. You don't want to get that person's name out into the public domain because that person will be dead very soon. This happened when Valerie Plame was outed as a CIA agent by the W. Bush administration. All her contacts in the Middle East disappeared within a week, and they've never been seen since. So that sort of stuff, yeah. But a lot of the methods are now public. The things that used to be secretive are not. High resolution satellite photos, that sort of thing.
Yeah, geospatial analysis.
So
we
there's
understand
no
what
point,
it all is about.
right? So there's no point. And if the information is corroborated by public source intelligence, what's the harm? What's the harm? You're not, you're basically confirming what others have already alluded to, and you're doing it for your own national interests. The downside, as long as you're not, identifying assets that are undercover or methods that are still not known to the public, and that surely occurs within Five Eyes, but everything else, you can open it up to public scrutiny, and I don't think you're going to suffer any appreciable loss of security by doing so.
Interesting times. Okay, Paul, let's wrap the program up. There's another scenario I'll put to you, and just if we, in brief, just respond to that. It's a counter position, if you like. If China does not follow that path that you were talking about, if China actually looks for its advantage, should Russia be withdrawing its military aggressions in Ukraine and going back onto its own soil, whatever that looks like, and China actually makes a move to get back to business as normal around the globe and actually starts to broker its own areas of approachment between the various parties. That would be an interesting move on China's part, and it would also counter the United States' position. That might be an outcome that perhaps is a possibility, if not coming along that scale of 0 being possibility, 10 being probability, and somewhere around the 5. So perhaps we'll watch that one as well. Paul, just over to you for a response, and then we'll wrap it up.
No, that's a very good point. That's a very good point. If the Chinese are long-sighted enough and can hold in check some of their near-term ambitions, the idea that they could be a post-conflict interlocutor between Russia and the rest of the world, that's a good one. That's a good one. Now, it takes some far-sighted people and the Chinese foreign ministry to say, look, we're going to try to be a semi-honest broker in this one. But they're probably the only country that the Russians could, quote unquote, trust to do so because of their power. You know, if we in New Zealand try to be an honest broker, everyone would say you're honest, but you have no power.
No,
you know,
and we've also taken that possibility away from ourselves as a country with New Zealand's partnership with NATO and its intelligence operations that are currently taking place.
Yeah, no, good point. Very, very good point. So no, that's a distinct possibility. I think though we always have to remember, and I'll leave you with this: even in authoritarian states, you have hardliners and softliners. Okay, you have hawks and doves. And when you get to big countries like the PRC, I mean, you know, not only are they not monolithic in their geopolitical views within the leadership cadre, but they're often conflicting views. And so I would imagine that military hardliners are saying, look, we can take some advantage along our land borders, particularly if the Russians start withdrawing troops from the Far East and what have you. You know, I mean, they're weak. You know, if we push that border, there's not much they can do to us, again, unless they want to go nuke. And since they're not going to nuke NATO, which is a far bigger threat to them, then they're certainly not going to do it to us if we grab, 100 kilometers of territory on the other side. I mean, there are people who think like that. The foreign ministry, hopefully does not, and says, no, we can extract concessions from the Russians because we have more leverage over the West than they do. I mean, we can actually either make things difficult for the West or, get back to a post-conflict status quo that has some semblance of peace baked into it. And so, no, very good point that the Chinese may actually step in as a broker for a post-conflict resolution. I guess it remains to be seen whether the hawks or the doves, win the day within Chinese decision-making circles.
And either way, it poses some absolute problems and headaches for the Russian Federation, of which
the bottom line,
have created themselves.
Yeah, the bottom line, Selwyn, is Russia's coming out of this diminished.
Yep.
I'll leave it at that. But there's no way that Russia's coming out of this with the great power status it had before, and it was already in decline, as you well know. They're coming out of this diminished and weakened. So maybe it's in their best interest to play footsie with the Chinese and try to piggyback on them in order to get a better outcome than otherwise would obtain.
Yeah. Sam adds, a very short comment there, but we'll go out on that one. America drops bombs, China does business. So, that's an interesting one. Okay, thanks for those who have been watching this episode live, and also for those that are going to join it to listen on demand. And thank you, Paul, for your contribution, your sage taking us through on the analysis of all these complex issues and where it's positioning for possible futures. we will be back in the next couple of weeks, if not next week, and we will be bringing another issue relating to geopolitics, intelligence and security of A View from Afar is what our brand is. So until that time, take care, and we look forward to your company once again. Goodbye.